The galaxy thought Earth was defenseless. Then the dreadnoughts of humanity answered. 12 dreadnoughts that should not exist opened fire within 4 seconds. No convocation chart had ever listed them. Not a wave, not a volley, not a warning. One sound, stretched thin across open space, the kind of sound that arrives before the mind has finished deciding it is real. Marshal Vatarnoth felt his flagship buck under the first hit and locked both hands on the bridge rail. Smoke from a blown conduit climbed past his face, sharp and metallic, before the scrubbers caught it. For 37 years, the convocation had called Earth defenseless. Tonight, the math came due all at once, with no time left to redo it. Ships down his line went dark or peeled away faster than the count on his own display could track. Tarnoth had cut a notch into his ear ridge for every system he had taken across his career. 9 notches, each one earned the same way: patience, superior numbers, an enemy who knew it was beaten before the first shot landed. None of those campaigns had taught him what a closed door sounds like from the wrong side. A sub-marshal's voice broke through the command channel, ragged with static. "Orders, Marshal. We need orders." Tarnoth had none to give. Protocol required confirmation from the central relay before any large-scale maneuver, and the relay was too far away, deaf to anything happening here in real time. He had built his entire career inside that protocol, trusted it the way a younger officer trusts gravity, without ever once asking what happened on the day it failed him. He thumbed the data slate chained to his wrist, the one that still logged a handful of old frigates and nothing else. The numbers on it had never once been wrong. They were wrong now, and there was no one left alive on that file to ask why. A voice cut through the static, level in a way that made his hide go cold. "This is Admiral Namer Castellan, Earth Defense Command. Stand down, or my ships finish what they started." Tarnoth said nothing. His doctrine had a line written for retreat, for surrender, for 100 kids of battlefield disaster. There was no time to argue, and no channel left to argue it on. He trusted a file that had never been wrong. He was about to learn why nobody had checked it in decades. The file that started it could fit in one hand. 2 days before that channel ever opened, Marshal Vatarnoth set it down on the speaking rail of the cinderglass hall, black glass humming faintly around a chamber packed with every seated delegation. The hall had stood for longer than most species in it had kept written records, its walls grown rather than built, each pane fused from the molten edge of a moon the convocation's founders had once mined down to nothing. Tarnoth smoothed the cover once and did not raise his voice. He never needed to. "Earth fields a handful of frigates," he said, "obsolete by any modern standard, flown by a species that has shown no shipbuilding advance worth tracking in a generation. I move the system to pending annexation, effective on this vote." A murmur ran the tiers, not disagreement, just the low rustle of delegations already certain how the count would land. Annexation votes rarely surprised anyone in this chamber anymore. They had become procedure dressed as decision. Elder Vessa Nerholt rose from the Corvessy bench before the chamber could settle. Her many eyes caught the light in a slow ripple as she turned toward the rail. She had held her seat for nearly 3 centuries, long enough to remember when this chamber still debated rather than simply confirmed. "That survey predates Earth's shipyards at the Harvorsen Drift," she said. "It has predated them for years, and no one has flown a verification pass since. I asked the convocation to look again before it votes on a number nobody has checked." Tarnoth did not turn his head. "The Drift is rock. It has been rock for longer than your delegation has held a seat in this hall." Laughter moved through the upper tiers, and the glass walls hummed a little louder under the sound, as though the chamber itself enjoyed the joke. Tally lights climbed the chamber's east wall as delegation after delegation cast its vote, the count rising in clean, fast steps that left no room for a recount anyone would bother requesting. Nerholt remained standing through the count, not because she expected it to change anything, but because sitting down felt like agreeing faster than the vote required her to. A young aide 2 seats down leaned toward her. "You could let this one go, Elder. There will be another vote next cycle." There always is. There is always another system, too, Nerholt said quietly. That is the part nobody else in this room seems to mind. The vote came in clean, 401 in favor, 13 against. Pending annexation, effective immediately, no further review scheduled. The east wall dimmed once the final tally locked, and the chamber moved on to its next item before the echo of the count had finished settling against the glass. A small minority had simply asked the convocation to check the math. The rest had not thought the math needed checking. Outside the chamber, a Corvusy aide caught up with Nerholt in the corridor, voice low, careful not to carry. You ask every session. They vote you down every session. And one day I will be right, Nerholt said, and no one will remember I asked first. She did not look back at the chamber doors. She had stopped expecting them to open for her a long time ago. What she had not stopped doing was filing every Earth report that crossed her desk, year after year, in a private archive none of the 401 had ever bothered asking her about. On Earth, the transcript reached Meridian Plateau before the ink would have dried on a written copy. Admiral Naima Castellan read it twice at her desk, poured chicory coffee into a dented field cup she had carried since her first posting, and did not pour a second. She carried the cup in her left hand, the one with a burn scar tracing the forearm from a reactor flash years back, the kind of scar nobody on this base needed explained to them twice. The dent in the cup's rim had come from a different year entirely, a different posting, a different kind of bad day, and she had never once considered replacing it. Whitlock leaned against the doorframe of her office, watching her finish the transcript. He had served under her for 11 years and had learned to read the set of her shoulders better than he read most written orders. Years now, and you still drink that motor oil, he said, nodding at the cup. Years now, and you still tap your fingers like it helps, Castellan said, not looking up. We're both creatures of habit, Dax. She set the transcript down and let her eyes move once across the room, past the dark windows, toward the ridge line where the drift's outer shelf cut a black edge against the stars. 33 years of planning lived behind that ridge. She had watched 3 different convocation administrations dismiss Earth in 3 different ways, each one slightly more confident than the last that there was nothing here worth a second look. She had let every one of them believe it. Castellan didn't raise her voice. She'd had decades to decide it wouldn't be necessary. Activate the program, she said into the comm. All of it. Commander Dax Whitlock's 2 fingers tapped the console once before he keyed the channel open, a habit his crew had stopped noticing years ago, or pretended not to, which amounted to the same thing on this base. Confirmed, Admiral, waking the drift. A junior officer at the next station looked up, young enough that this would be her first activation, old enough to already understand what it meant. All of it, ma'am. The whole fleet. Every hull, Castellan said, not looking up from the transcript. We didn't build it to keep half of it asleep. In the command room above the dock, she laid a single chart on the table, the drift rendered in cross-section, every hidden berth marked with a small grey dot that had sat unlit on every convocation survey for 3 decades. We are not meeting them at the edge of the drift, she said. We let them come all the way in, past the markers, until they think the rock around them is just rock. Then we close the door. Whitlock studied the chart, 2 fingers tapping once against its edge. And if their scouts read something before we're ready, then we'll find out how good our cover really is, Castellan said. It's held for decades. It can hold for 1 more day. Their doctrine won't let a sub-marshal commit without central confirmation, she added, already moving toward the door. Hold position long enough, and they'll be arguing with their own relay instead of fighting us. She paused at the threshold, one hand on the frame, and looked back at the chart a moment longer than the room expected. 33 years, she said, mostly to herself. Let's see if it was worth it. Calloway's work tune died in her throat. She keyed the channel without another word, opening a frequency she had only known existed since her transfer to this post, and hummed it back to life without realizing she was doing it. Launch authorization went out fleet-wide inside a minute, riding a line that had never once carried real traffic until now. "You're going to give away the surprise," Whitlock muttered, and for one breath, before the weight of the order caught up with either of them, they both nearly laughed. Riveted under the forward viewport of the dreadnought Ember Vow was a small brass plate, hand-stamped with a single date. It meant nothing to anyone who had not seen the file the convocation never bothered to update. It meant everything to the crew now climbing aboard her, boots ringing on decking that had waited longer for footsteps than most of them had been alive. The convocation's intelligence file on Earth was 37 years old, and Earth had spent every one of those years building something that file never accounted for. Engineers who had never met each other across 3 different shifts had each added a piece to the same hull without ever knowing the full shape of what they were assembling, because no single shipyard had ever been allowed to see the whole program at once. Secrecy, on Earth, had become its own kind of engineering discipline. Specialist Connor Drayle checked his rifle, then the worn token he carried for a sibling who hadn't lived to see this day, the same ritual he ran before every drill for years running. He didn't talk about why. Nobody on the Ember Vow asked him to. The token had worn smooth on one side from years of the same thumb passing over it, and the only mark still visible was a single letter, the first of a name he never said out loud anymore. 3 sectors out, and unaware any of this was happening, freighter pilot Joss Tulwar taped a fresh photo of his niece above the dash and kept flying his usual route. He had run this corridor for 6 years without a single incident worth logging, and tonight felt, for the first hour of it, exactly like every other night before it. A dispatcher crackled over his comm, bored, routine. "Tulwar, you copy normal traffic patterns out past the drift markers tonight." "Quiet as always," Tulwar said, eyes on the photo. "Why?" "No reason, probably nothing." The line went dead before he could ask again. Sister hulls that the convocation's last survey did not list answered the Ember Vow's wake call inside the hour, crude and armed, and waiting on a program decades deep, engines climbing from a low thrum to a full-throated growl that shook dust loose from rock. The drift had hidden them under for longer than most of the crew could remember being told the truth. One by one, the dreadnoughts broke from the rock that had hidden them, running lights dark, hulls cold enough to read as drifting stone to anything less patient than a trained eye. The Ember Vow went last. Sliding free of her berth with a shudder, the crew felt up through the deck plating before the inertial dampers caught it. On the bridge, nobody spoke. They had trained for this more times than any of them could count, and now that it was real, none of the drills had prepared them for how quiet it actually felt. Castellan set the dented cup down, untouched past the first sip, and looked at the board where the lights had just gone live, every one of them green. "Get me a flight path into the drift," she said. "Quietly. I want them moving before anyone outside this room knows we exist." While Castellan's fleet slipped free of the rock that had hidden it for decades, on the far side of the drift's outer markers, Tarnoth's armada was already crossing in. Long lines of grey hulls swept past sensor buoys planted to watch nothing but empty stone, exactly as the old survey promised they would find. The armada moved with the easy confidence of a force that had never once had its assumptions tested, formation wide and unhurried. Scouts running standard, sweeps more out of habit than expectation. Ensign Ilo Vantris sat at a scope and watched 12 heat blooms light up where the log insisted there was only drifting rock. She ran the reading twice. Both times the signatures held steady, clustered tight, moving in a pattern no asteroid field had ever managed on its own. She was new enough to her post that she still double-checked everything, a habit her instructors had praised, and her current commanding officers found mildly tiresome. She sent it up the chain anyway. The reply came back clipped and bored. "Drift debris throws heat all the time, Ensign. Old impact scars. Ice melt off the rock face. Log it as background." 12 separate sources, Vantris said. "In formation, that's not melt." The channel closed before she could finish the sentence. Word of it reached Tarnoth's ready room between 2 other reports, and he barely looked up from the chart in front of him. "Sensor ghosts," he said. "The drift throws false readings on every approach. Tell the ensign to stop wasting relay time." His aide hesitated at the door. She's already flagged it twice, Marshal. Then she can flag it a third time after we've moved past it, Tarnoth said, and went back to the chart. 3 sectors out, freighter pilot Joss Tulwa felt his hauler buck sideways hard enough to knock the photo of his niece loose from the dash. He caught it before it hit the floor, swore once, and checked his instruments. Something heavy had passed close enough to throw a wake this far out, and none of his usual traffic alerts had said a word about it. He didn't ask questions. He banked off the flight corridor without waiting for clearance and let whatever it was have the lane. Vantris watched her readings hold for a third sweep, sharper now, the 12 signatures closer together than before. She filed the report a second time, flagged urgent, and copied it straight to the flagship instead of waiting on the relay chain to crawl it there on its own. It was a small act of insubordination by the letter of procedure, and she knew it, and she did it anyway because the numbers in front of her had stopped allowing for any other choice. By the time it reached Tarnoth's console, the picture on it had already changed. The 12 shapes were no longer drifting. They were moving with purpose, engines lit, burning toward a heading that put them between his armada and open space. Marshal, his aide's voice had lost its boredom now. The relay's confirming Vantris's numbers. Whatever's out there isn't rock. Tarnoth set down the chart. On the Ember Vows bridge, Castellan watched the same engagement window close from the other side of it, calm as the chicory in her cup had long since gone cold. "They've made us," Whitlock said, 2 fingers tapping the console once before he caught himself. "Let them," Castellan said. "We're not hiding anymore. We're closing the door." She gave the order, and the fleet that had spent decades pretending to be stone stopped pretending. 12 dreadnoughts shifted formation in the same breath, sliding into a ring around the edge of Tarnoth's armada instead of driving straight into the center of it. No convocation doctrine had a name for the shape they made. Conquest fleets met each other head-on, or they didn't meet at all. Nobody on the other side of that hall had ever built a fleet whose only purpose, for 33 quiet years, was to wait for exactly this moment and close around it. Every simulation Earth Defense Command had run for 3 decades had practiced this single maneuver and nothing else, refining it generation after generation of officers until the formation had become something closer to instinct than instruction. Tarnoth watched the formation complete on his own display and felt something in his chest go very still. "Open every channel," he said. "Central relay, fleet command, anyone. I need authorization to break this pattern." "Central relay isn't answering, Marshal. We're out of range." He had conquered 9 systems. None of them had taught him what a closed door sounds like from the wrong side. He checked the relay. He checked the doctrine. He checked everything else, and none of it gave him an order he was allowed to give on his own authority. Decades of campaign discipline had built a chain of command that needed permission from somewhere it could no longer reach, and the silence on the other end of that chain was the only answer he was going to get. He had built his career trusting that chain completely, had never once needed to test what happened if it broke at the exact moment he needed it most. A sub-marshal's voice broke through, sharp with a fear he wasn't bothering to hide anymore. "Marshal, the Southern Line is asking for orders. They want to know if we're committing or pulling back." "Hold position," Tarnoth said, because it was the only order doctrine still let him give. "Holding isn't an option anymore, sir. They're closing faster than we can hold." Tarnoth's data slate sat chained to his wrist, still showing the same 12 frigates it had shown him for 37 years, a number that had never once been wrong because no one in 37 years had thought to ask it again. The 12 shapes drawing the ring tight around his armada were not a correction to that file. They were proof the file had never described his enemy at all, only the part of her that she had let him see. He gave the order to pull the outer line back, the only move the doctrine still allowed him, and it left by the time it reached the ships at the edge of the formation, a third of his line already past the point where falling back would do any good. Back on the Ember Vow, Calloway's hands hovered over the open channel, waiting on a word from the Admiral that hadn't come yet. Castellan set her cup down without finishing it, the dent in its rim catching the bridge light the way it always had, and reached for the comm herself. She'd had 33 years to get ready for this exact silence on the other end of the line, and she didn't need anyone else to speak it for her. Castellan's order had already gone out across the open channel, plain enough that no translation routine could soften it. Stand down, or the fleet finishes what it started. She didn't repeat herself. On the Ember Vows bridge, Calloway watched the channel stay open and silent, waiting on an answer that wasn't coming. Tarnoth didn't answer. He couldn't. Doctrine gave him 100 phrases for retreat, and none of them fit a moment where retreat itself wasn't a move anyone had cleared him to make. A junior officer's voice broke through the silence on his side, thin with panic. "Marshal, the southern line is breaking formation. They're firing without authorization." 3 ships at the edge of the ring opened up at once, weapons lashing out at the nearest dreadnought in a burst that hit shielding and did nothing else. 1 broke first. Then 3 more followed. Then half the southern line was firing into open space. No target locked, no order given, just panic looking for somewhere to spend itself. Castellan watched the readout flare red across her own board and did not change the order. "Hold the ring," she said. "Nobody fires back, not yet." Whitlock's 2 fingers stopped on the console. "They're shooting at us, Admiral." "They're shooting at nothing," Castellan said. "Let them waste it." One of the panicked ships pushed past the others, braking hard for open space at the one gap in the ring that wasn't a gap at all, just a stretch of dark Tarnoth's sensors hadn't mapped yet. It didn't make it. The ring closed around it before it cleared the edge, and its hull went dark on every board watching, swallowed without a single shot fired from the human side. On the flagship, Tarnoth watched that ship vanish from his display and understood something he hadn't let himself understand a few minutes earlier. The 12 frigates in his survey had never been Earth's fleet. They had been the only part of it anyone outside this rock had ever been allowed to see. A decoy his own intelligence service had mistaken for the whole picture, filed and forgotten for 37 years because nobody had thought to look twice. He had conquered 9 systems. None of them had taught him what a closed door sounds like from the wrong side. His aide's voice cracked through again. "Central Relay still isn't responding, Marshal. We're alone out here." "I know," Tarnoth said, and for the first time since the vote in the Cinderglass Hall, he didn't sound certain of anything. Far across the drift, a Corvessy listening post caught a fragment of the open channel traffic and routed it without clearance straight to Elder Nerholt's private line. She had tracked every Earth report that crossed her desk for nearly 3 centuries, filed and dismissed by delegations that never once asked her to check her own math. This time, the fragment held a name she recognized from no survey she had ever read. "Play it again," she told the aide who'd brought it to her, and listened a second time to a transmission the convocation hadn't authorized anyone to intercept yet. She sat very still through the second playback, her many eyes fixed on nothing in particular, the way she always looked when a piece of information had not yet finished rearranging everything she thought she knew. Back inside the ring, Ensign Vantress's scope held steady on the 12 dreadnought signatures she had logged twice and been told to ignore both times. She didn't say "I told you so." She didn't need to. She fed her readings straight into the tactical net instead, every number she had, so that whoever was left giving orders on Tarnoth's side had no excuse left to call it sensor noise. A ship near her own position, then a second, then a whole flank peeling off formation in a panic that spread faster than any order could chase it down. Tarnoth's sub-marshals kept calling for instructions he had no authority to give. He gave the only one doctrine still allowed him, the order to hold the line and wait on a relay confirmation that wasn't coming, and watched his own fleet start coming apart anyway, ship by ship, faster than any chain of command built on permission could keep up with. Jos Tulwar, 3 sectors clear of all of it, caught a garbled distress burst on an open frequency he wasn't supposed to be listening to and didn't recognize a single hull designation in it. He didn't report it. He just kept his hauler pointed away from whatever was happening behind him and didn't look back. On the Ember Vow, Drayle stood at his post with his rifle slung and the worn token from his sibling pressed flat against his palm, the same ritual he'd run before every drill for years, except this time nobody around him treated it as a drill. He didn't say anything about why he carried it. Nobody asked. They had learned a long time ago that some things a person carries don't need explaining out loud. Castellan watched the panic spread across Tarnoth's line from her own board. Unmoved, the dent in her cup catching the light the same way it had for 33 years of waiting on exactly this moment. One ship broke, then three, then the whole southern flank, scattering into a ring that had already closed around every gap they thought they had. "They're not going to hold," Whitlock said, watching the same readout she was. "Whatever's left of his command structure, it's gone." "It went the moment he stopped checking his own file," Castellan said. "We just gave him a reason to notice." She didn't give the next order yet. She let the silence stretch instead, the same silence that had built this fleet in secret for 3 decades, and watched Tarnoth's armada keep tearing itself apart from the inside, while the ring around it held without firing a single round. Nerholt set down the transmission fragment her aide had brought her and looked toward the chamber doors, already shut for the night, already empty of every delegate who had voted to stop checking the math. 13 of them had asked the convocation to look again. None of the rest had thought it worth the time. He didn't send word to the chamber yet. She wanted to hear how this ended first, the same way the 13 who'd voted with her would want to hear it, before anyone tried to explain it away as something other than what it was. She had watched too many inconvenient reports get smoothed over by delegations more interested in their own comfort than in the truth of what they had voted on, and she had no intention of letting this one suffer the same fate by speaking too soon. On the flagship, Tarnoth's aide spoke again, quieter this time. "Orders, Marshal. Anything. The line needs to hear something from you." Tarnoth looked at the ring holding steady around what was left of his formation, no shot fired from the other side since the panic started, and understood that the silence wasn't a gap in the human strategy. It was the strategy. They had built a fleet patient enough to wait 33 years for one moment, and they were patient enough now to let his own doctrine finish the job for them. He gave the order to hold, the only one left that doctrine allowed, and braced for whatever came next on a deck that had gone quiet enough to hear his own breathing over the dying static of his fleet, falling apart around him. The order that had been hanging over the ring since it closed finally came. Castellan didn't dress it up. She said one word into the open channel, and 12 dreadnoughts that no convocation chart had ever listed answered together, the same 4 seconds the whole program had been built 30 years to deliver. They fired, they held position, they did not chase the ones who broke and ran. On the Ember Vows bridge, Whitlock's fingers stopped tapping the console. Calloway's humming stopped. Drayle's hand closed once around the worn token in his palm and did not open again until the readout had finished climbing. 340 of Tarnoth's ships went dark or peeled off the line inside that same 4 seconds, more of his command than he had time left to count before the number stopped meaning anything useful to him. Tarnoth gripped the rail of his own bridge as his flagship lurched under a hit that buckled a forward strut and threw smoke across the command deck. He didn't speak. There was nothing left in the doctrine that told him what to say to a fleet that had stopped waiting for his orders before it ever fired a shot of its own. A voice broke through his command channel that wasn't his aide's. "This is Submarshal Orsh. The Marshal's authority is void under combat protocol. I'm assuming Southern Command until further notice." Tarnoth didn't argue it. He keyed the retreat order to whatever was left of his line and watched half of them ignore him in favor of a man who just declared himself in charge over an open channel that every delegation back at the Cinderglass Hall would eventually hear played back to them. Castellan watched the readout settle, the ring still closed, no further fire ordered or needed. She picked up the comm one more time and opened it on the same frequency Tarnoth had used to announce the annexation 2 days earlier. "Check your math. Stand down." 5 words. She didn't repeat them. She didn't wait to see if he answered. The fragment reached the cinderglass hall before sunrise on the convocation's clock, routed without authorization through a Corvusy listening post that had been quietly recording the channel since the panic started. Elder Nerholt played it once, then again, the way she'd tracked every report on Earth that crossed her desk for longer than most of the chamber had held its current seats. 13 had asked. 401 had not. Now every delegation that mattered would hear the recording whether they wanted to or not. He didn't send word to the chamber floor that night. She let the recording sit on a private channel a little longer, long enough that no one could later claim it had been altered before they heard it for themselves. When morning finally came to the chamber's artificial cycle, she stood at the speaking rail where Tarnoth had stood 2 days before, and played the recording without preamble, without commentary, letting the silence afterward do whatever work her own words might have failed to do. No one laughed this time. 3 sectors out, Joss Tulwar caught the tail end of the same broadcast on a frequency his hauler wasn't licensed to monitor, 3 words clear before the signal dropped. Check your math. He didn't know what it meant. He turned the photo of his niece face up again where it had slid sideways on the dash and kept flying. A salvage tender moved through the debris field 2 days after the engagement ended, cataloguing wreckage the convocation would later argue over who had jurisdiction to inspect. Among the drifting pieces, it logged a small brass plate, torn loose from where it had been riveted beneath a viewport, stamped with a single date. None of the salvage crew thought worth flagging as anything more than routine manufacturing data. It took the convocation's own archivists most of a season to bother running that date against anything. When someone finally did, they found it matched, almost to the week, the date their own 37-year-old survey had been filed and closed for good. Tarnoth survived the engagement. He did not survive the inquiry that followed it. Within the week, his command was stripped from him by the same body that had cheered his vote 2 days before any of this started, and no formal review of the survey that had failed him was ever opened in its place. The convocation, it turned out, was far more interested in punishing the officer who had trusted a bad file than in asking who had written it, or why no one had ever checked it again. Sub-Marshal Orsh was confirmed in his place within the month, and the new survey his office commissioned on Earth ran to several hundred pages, thick with caveats and contingencies, the kind of document that exists mostly to ensure no single name can ever again be attached to a single confident sentence about what a species can or cannot do. He was last seen on a minor outpost near the edge of convocation space, a posting with no ships and no notches left to cut. A salvage report had reached him there too, the recovered plate logged and forwarded along with the rest of the Ember Vow's debris, more out of bureaucratic habit than any real interest in what it meant. He sat alone in a narrow quarters room and turned the plate over once in his hand, running one thumb across the stamped numbers until they caught the light. They thought our clock had stopped. They never heard it counting. He set the plate face up on the table in front of him and did not put it away. His data slate sat beside it, unchained from his wrist for the first time in years, screen dark, the old survey still loaded and still wrong. Outside the narrow window, the stars he had once commanded fleets across went on without him, indifferent to the difference between a marshal and a man with nothing left but time. He didn't reach for the slate. He left it dark and began, very quietly, to count. On Earth, the program that had spent 33 years pretending to be stone went back to waiting, though not quite the way it had before. Castellan stood at the same ridge line that night, the dent in her cup catching starlight instead of bridge light, and watched the last of the dreadnoughts settle back into berths that no longer needed to hide. "They'll send someone else," Whitlock said, joining her at the rail, 2 fingers tapping once against the stone before he caught himself and let his hand fall still. "Smarter this time, more careful." "Let them be careful," Castellan said. "We've had 33 years of practice being patient. We can spare a few more." Below them, the Ember Vow sat dark and quiet in her berth, the brass plate beneath her viewport gone now, lost somewhere in the debris field she had left behind. a single stamped date drifting among the wreckage of an armada that had once been certain it knew exactly what it was sailing into. Drayle climbed down from the gangway last, the worn token still warm in his palm from where his thumb had pressed it through every hour of the engagement. He looked back once at the hull above him, at the dark hole where the plate used to sit, and didn't feel the absence the way he expected to. The ship hadn't needed the date stamped on her to remember what she was built for. None of them had. Far across the drift, in a chamber that had voted 401 to 13 only 2 days before, Elder Nerholt finally sat down at her bench, the recording still playing somewhere behind her in a private archive nobody would ever again accuse her of keeping for no reason. She did not feel triumphant. She felt mostly tired, the particular tiredness of being right about something that had cost far more than it should have to prove. She made a note in her own private file, the kind no vote could strike from the record, and closed it without reading it back. Check your math, it said. Some of them already had.